Hi, everyone. Welcome to lecture guide number 8. What we're going to cover this week is a period in Italy following the High Renaissance known as La Maniera or Mannerism, as well as some other things that are kind of loosely associated with trends that run counter to the classical trends of the High Renaissance. And then we'll move over and back to the Northern Renaissance in Germany and in the Netherlands. So if you're keeping track here, our time period, what we've done is we've kind of marched our way through the Renaissance in Italy, taken a short look at the Renaissance in the north and Flanders in particular. Then we looked at things that were happening in northern Italy. And now we're covering the time period roughly from the 1520s or so all the way to the end of the century in both Italy first, and then we'll move up north to Germany and talk about the effect of the Protestant Reformation on the traditions of the Northern Renaissance, and then finally end up in the Netherlands for a little bit. So, here's the thing. So on the screen in front of you, you have a list of some of the characteristics of the Mannerist period in Italy. Mannerism it's a style that develops in Italy following the death of Raphael and corresponds in some ways with some of the things you saw in the second stage of Michelangelo's career. It comes from a different context in a way, or responds to different things going in the context in Italy. One which your textbook points out, which is a minor thing, but it's worth mentioning, is that after 2 or 3 centuries of classical works of art, people are looking for something else. And so, they're a little bit tired of this same old stable compositions and the same old set of stylistics, and maybe they're looking for something else. But perhaps even more importantly in the historical context, remember all of the things that Anthony Blunt said in that article about Michelangelo that are happening in the world, right? So we have, the founding of the New World. We have the rise of Protestantism in the north that questions some of the standard positions of the Catholic Church and also starts to call into question the propriety of particular forms of religious imagery. It also pushes for a different kind of style, one that you'll see responds more to the emotional impact of works of art. Then you have, in quick succession, the English Church separating from the Catholic Church to some degree under Henry VIII. You have Charles V marching into Rome and sacking it. You have the scientific positions taken by people like Galileo and later Copernicus on our place in the solar system. All of these things have an impact on art at a kind of basic level in that, first and foremost, the Catholic Church stops commissioning as many large-scale public works of art as they had before. And what this leads to is a number of private patrons basically commissioning works of art for their own interest and with their own meanings in mind. Just like when we were talking about Giorgione's Tempest, and I said, listen, if you're creating a work of art for public consumption, you want it to be understandable to the public. But if you're working out things between an artist and a private patron, maybe things don't need to be as clear. And so those things are at work in this style. It's a little bit of a muddy territory, frankly. There's no kind of direct parallels in the Mannerist period between some big historical event and what you see in the art per se. So start by thinking of Mannerism as an anti-classical style, or a style that breaks with some of the standard things that you would expect to find in the classical Renaissance style. So these kind of, stylistics that I've got listed up here include things like, charm and grace and playfulness, right? They don't have the high seriousness of the Italian Renaissance. They don't necessarily seek to create the ideal form, or rather their ideal form is not based upon something that necessarily corresponds with human proportionality. And they certainly are less interested in rationality. And this leads us to the second major point. So, second part of the stylistics is that formal beauty, the beauty of beautiful lines and beautiful colors and extending the human body so that its proportions are beautiful but don't correspond with a human body, are something that you often find in the Mannerist period. And not that this isn't a component of a lot of other works of art, but in the Mannerist period, many times artists are trying to show off. So there's a lot of virtuosity. There's a great kind of nod to elegance and sophistication of a private patron rather than public consumption. And then maybe the most important thing, and these aren't mutually exclusive, in the Mannerist period, you get a lot of ambiguity. It's ambiguity of meaning, ambiguity of spatial setting, sometimes even ambiguity of subject matter, which runs counter to the classical interest in rationality. You get a lot of manipulation of form and even distortion of form, which we'll see coming up. So the first artist that I wanted to look at is someone that I gave you a short reading in that set of excerpts of reading from Jansen, the artist primary documents. This is the artist Paolo Veronese. And Paolo Veronese isn't quite a Mannerist artist. He kind of doesn't fit in any strict stylistic category. He's sometimes linked into the Mannerist, though, in the ambiguity of his subject matter. And what you're looking at here in front of you is a work that's very large scale. It's a fresco painting on a wall. Veronese, by the way, was famous for these huge architectural settings for his works. They're a good way to kind of decorate an otherwise boring wall, just fill it up with this beautiful trompe-l'oeil architecture. But in this case, originally, the subject was called The Last Supper. And then later, when he got in trouble with the Inquisition, and the Inquisition, by the way, is kind of the judicial arm of the Catholic Church, instead of changing any of the things that they had problems with, he just changed the title of the work to Feast in the House of Levi. So in the Inquisition tribunal, that little excerpt that I asked you to read, what the Inquisition is worried about is the propriety of the subject. Remember, as I said before, the Last Supper is it's a really important subject in Christianity. It's the moment in which the Eucharist and the communion is first started. It's also the moment in which Christ announces his betrayal, and everything kind of heads into that territory of leading up to the crucifixion. So why is the Inquisition so worried about this work? Because the subject itself, which originally, again, was called The Last Supper, doesn't seem to be about either one of those things. It's not focusing on the Eucharist. It's not focusing on the betrayal. As Veronese says in front of the Inquisition, hey, I'm just thinking about this historically with, people sitting down to a last meal. I heard it was in a rich house, so I made it a rich architectural setting, and I filled it up with all these little various anecdotes that frankly don't have much to do with any kind of religious moral messages. The Inquisition is worried about this, especially in the 1570s when this was painted, because the Protestant Reformation has been around now at this time period for quite a while. And they, the Protestants are constantly calling into the question the way that Catholics have represented religious subject matter. Why is there so many nudes? Why are there, mythological stories from Greece and Rome intermixed with Christian subjects and so forth? And of course, the Protestants are constantly arguing, as you will have read, that the Second Commandment and other parts of the Bible forbid any religious imagery, which of course Martin Luther as you will have read, doesn't believe to be the case. Martin Luther argues that it's only representations of God that are off limits according to the Bible. But in any case, they're worried about people just doing anything they want with religious subject matter, so they call him in front of the Inquisition tribunal and they ask him a bunch of questions about this work of art. So let's go through it. It's fairly quick. I think the tribunal is hilarious because what do? If we get up here close in the center where Jesus is eating, they ask a question that's kind of leading. They want Veronese to have a good response to it. So they say something like, what is Peter doing? What's he up to here? And what they're looking for is an answer that will say, hey, it's about this moral message or something of that sort. But Veronese just says Peter's hungry, so he's grabbing a piece of chicken, right? No real reason behind it. And then they ask things like, what's the guy doing over there who's picking his teeth? And you see him in between these columns over here. And Veronese's answer is, well, he's eating and he got something caught in his teeth, and so he needed to get it out. Or they ask him, why is there a dwarf in this picture? And there's a dwarf you see down here with some kind of little bird. And Veronese says, listen, it was in a rich guy's house. I've heard that dwarves are around for entertainment. I just put him in there because he would be fun, and the Inquisition is not having it. In any case, the solution to this whole problem was just for Veronese to change the title of the work. Some artists weren't so lucky and were actually charged with crimes against the church. A more typical work from the Mannerist period, again, continuing on this subject of the Last Supper, is Tintoretto's work here. Tintoretto, in this work, has something kind of typically Manneristic. You can tell that this is an Italian Renaissance picture, right? It doesn't have any of the clarity, the order, the rationality. The figures aren't idealized in the same way. And that's on purpose. In a way, the way that he's chosen to represent the Last Supper here corresponds quite nicely with the component of the story he wants to tell, which is this Last Supper, unlike Leonardo's and unlike Giotto's, is all about the nature of the Holy Sacrament of the communion. So remember this. At the Last Supper, Jesus transforms the bread on the table into his body and the wine on the table into his blood, and this starts the whole story of the Holy Communion, which Catholics practice. Now, Catholics believe this is an actual transubstantiation that occurs during Catholic Mass, while as the Protestants up north believe it's just a commemorative act. It only happened once at the Last Supper of Jesus Christ, and then after that, we do the same ritual, but the bread does not turn into the body and the wine does not turn into the bread. So this is a mystery, right? This is a mysterious, really kind of magical moment in which this major sacrament takes place. And Tintoretto is trying to play that up here. Everything is very dark in the background, right? And then the areas of the focal point, Jesus here, are the brightest areas. There is no rational light source to this work. He just illuminates whatever he wants any way he wants, so it breaks with classical aesthetics that way. We don't have a strong pyramidal form. We have instead, and we don't have horizontals and verticals either, we have a big diagonal that runs the table all the way through this scene. Breaking with the rationality again of the classical period, we have these strange spirit forms. I suppose there's to be angels swirling around in the sky, adding lots of energy and movement to the work. Remember how classical works are really stable, don't look like they move much. But that's not to say there isn't any organization in this work. It's just organization around the mystery of the sacrament, about playing up this kind of magical moment in time. So, for instance, the ordering system, if you look at Christ here, who is, again, dead center in the work and the brightest form, and then he leans down to feed, John the Evangelist, then you can just follow these heads all the way down. You get to the end, and notice how this leg, which is very highlit, points you down here, and you get picked up by the dog and through another arm over here and through the arms over here to this figure, and then you swirl around to the back of the table and come all the way forward again. So there is a lot of manipulation of the way that the viewer is going to see this, and of course he organizes it in such a way that Judas Iscariot is on the other side of the table from the rest of the apostles. Think about this. You're going to have this on your next quiz for sure. A compare and contrast. How are these two works different stylistically, and what do those differences mean? Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper on the right and Tintoretto's on the left. A really good example of the Mannerist period, Acabo da Pontormo. This is a work that is usually called the Entombment, although it's not clear that it's really an entombment. It looks a little bit like a lamentation scene. Just take a minute, maybe even pause my lecture and look at this and note all of the different ways this work breaks with classical precedents, right? So we don't have a pyramidal form. We don't have a clear focal point. The colors here are not analogous colors, but kind of pastel, very bright, popping colors. We have a lot of spatial ambiguity here, don't we? I mean, what are these figures up here standing on? How far are they away? Who are these characters all supposed to be? It's really hard to tell who they're supposed to be and so forth. We even have some weirdness in the coloring where this guy in the foreground and skin all over the place looks like it's got this kind of pale pink hue to it. And where is that color coming from and why is it here? We also have things like the proportionality of the bodies. These aren't perfect proportioned bodies at all. They're all bodies that seem to have been constructed so as to set up the composition itself, which many of you can probably recognize, is a little bit of a swirling vortex, isn't it? Everything kind of swirls around in the middle here rather than being set up as a pyramidal form. So the bodies, like the extended neck of this figure, just change so that they fit into that compositional strategy. Now, I said that these artists are very interested in, kind of and beauty for its own sake, and oftentimes the meanings are worked out between the patron and the artist. And, for us here, 500 years removed from these, we don't know what that might have been. So I want to point out a couple of these closer up. This is clearly the Virgin Mary. She's given a kind of pride of place, again, not as much overlapping on her. And so she's going to stand out. This figure here that I pointed out before, look at that kind of pink hue to his body. Why does he have that pink hue here? Why is it showing up? And it shows up on the back of this figure over here as well. And then, of course, these artists often will make little subtle allusions to earlier works of art. This is part of their virtuosity. This is part of their sophistication. This is them showing off, in other words. And the figure of Christ here in Pontormo's work is basically, meant to correspond very closely with Michelangelo's famous Pietà. It's like he's quoting this earlier artist in his work by borrowing that body from the earlier Michelangelo work itself and putting it in here. So what is the meaning of this work, if you can say that? I mean, how are we to understand this work? Well, there is a rationale to this, and it goes like this. We figured out, art historians did, a number of years ago, that the mystery of this work was its original placement. When this work it's a very big work. It was set up in a private chapel, and in that chapel, right outside the chapel, was a dome space that already existed, that already had a painting of God reaching out to his followers, to his flock, and basically kind of inviting them to follow his pathway. When Pontormo was commissioned to create this work, he actually used that earlier work as part of the context for his own. And so God, in a way, is reaching out to these figures in this painting in its original placement. And now we get to the key to this work. If you're looking at all these emotional faces on here that look fairly melodramatic, and remember the Renaissance itself didn't really like emotionality, so you see a little bit more emotionality here, but they don't seem overly pained. It's because the moment we're witnessing in the story is actually Christ being taken back into heaven. It's like God in the other painting is reaching out and taking Christ back from his followers. Thus you get this kind of empty space in the middle where Christ is leaving. And this explains the colors, because in the Bible it says, at this moment in time where Christ is brought back into heaven in the resurrection, which is, of course, the holiday of Easter, which celebrates this, bright, beautiful lights shined upon the earth. And that's why these figures, for instance, are illuminated as if they have sunburns or something, because God's light is shining on them. And yes, if you're wondering why we pick pastel colors, bright, vibrant colors for Easter, it comes from this long tradition. Another of these Manneristic painters is this artist whose name was Parmigianino. And Parmigianino in this work, kind of appropriately titled The Madonna of the Long Neck, once again creates a work of art that is kind of typically Manneristic in the ways it breaks from the traditions of classicism. So first of all, we've got basically a kind of nativity scene, a presentation scene of the Virgin Mary holding in her lap the Christ child. That's straightforward enough, but there is a lot of ambiguity, isn't there? Off to the left-hand side of the picture, you have all these strange characters crowding into the scene. These are angels. Remember I said before, you can tell angels even if they don't have wings, because their gender is a little bit ambiguous and they are diminutive. They're a little bit smaller than other creatures, and they're oftentimes incredibly beautiful with youthful beauty. They're here then to reference the idea that Christ came from heaven, and we see them holding in their hand an urn here, a kind of vase. And that vase is a vessel. So Christ came to earth through the vessel of the Virgin Mary. But the sophisticated illusion of this vase is even more than that. Aristotle had once said that women's contribution to childbirth was as if they were a flower pot, a pot into which men planted their fully formed seed, and then women kind of function as a bit of an incubator to bring that baby into the world. Now, I know that probably made a lot of women out there angry and a few men as well. It's not me saying this is Aristotle. But it is kind of an appropriate symbol for the Virgin Mary, who was a passive vessel into which God incarnated Christ, and eventually this child is born. On the other side, you see a man unrolling a scroll next to these columns that seem to go nowhere. That's because this painting isn't actually finished. This brick red would have been filled up with, some more painting that never got done. And this guy is most likely a prophet. But this is really ambiguous, right? No Renaissance classical artist would do something this irrational to juxtapose totally different kind of centuries in time against one another. But this artist does it in order to reference the idea that the prophecies of the coming of Christ go back to ancient times. And then we get to some of the other components of this work. If you're looking at Christ and you're saying, wow, his proportions are all wonky, and frankly, he looks kind of dead, or he doesn't look healthy, right? That's on purpose. That's to make him look or allude to Pietà figures, right? If you just go back here and you look at Michelangelo's Pietà, same idea, and thus we get into this equation, the alpha omega again. Christ is born, so is to die. If you go a step further than that and you start looking at the proportionality of the Virgin Mary here, obviously that proportionality is not based upon any, human proportions, but the artist has kind of taken liberties with that to make a big, beautiful form with these elongated fingers and nice sweeping curves to the drapery and an elegant long neck and a beautiful face on the top of that. It's a beauty that's made up of form rather than corresponding to real human beings. And I'll just point this out. I didn't say it before, but some of you probably noticed. If we go back to Michelangelo's Pietà, look at the Virgin Mary here. Her proportionality is totally wrong. If she were to stand up, she would be enormous. And Michelangelo did this because had he made her a small woman holding in her lap a full-size human male, it would have been a really, poor composition. So he changed the proportionality of the Virgin Mary so as to allow for a beautiful composition. And Parmigianino has just taken that one step further. Then finally, I wanted to point this out. The Virgin Mary is showing a lot of skin, frankly. We've got all this really, really diaphanous drapery, meaning you can see through it. And you can see her navel, and you can see a little bit of nipple up here. That's to reference the idea that she's human and that Christ is born of woman. Notice that, again, the artist has gone out of his way to show Christ's genitalia. He easily could have covered that up in order to say, Christ is God made human through the vehicle of a woman. Let's look at how different the way that the subject is represented by Raphael, an exemplary high Renaissance and classically, conditioned artist, and the Mannerist period. Totally different approaches to the same subject. And then one of the oddest works of art of the Mannerist period, created by an artist by the name of Bronzino. This is a work that is usually called the Allegory of Cupid and Venus, or the Allegory of Venus and Cupid. And sometimes you hear it called Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time. There are a ton of different interpretations to this, and the one that I'm going to give you is slightly different than, or in some ways, than the one that is in your book. First and foremost, it's a work that's set up of symbolism, right? We've got a female nude in the foreground, beautifully represented, in a strange pose, right? This is a very Mannerist pose. It's a pose where the body is kind of all folded into space. But it's a beautiful body, right? This is one of those double articulations again, because believe it or not, the whole moral message of this work is don't get caught up in sexual erotic activities. They're wrong, and yet it puts a ton of that beautiful body in your face, to take pleasure from. The symbolism in this is pretty straightforward to me. Some of the characters are a little bit questionable, but up here in the far right corner, you see this old man, and behind him is an hourglass. This guy represents Father Time. On the other side, unlike what your text says, I don't think this is supposed to be truth. She's holding the curtain back. She's trying not to allow Father Time to pull it forward. And you can actually, if you look at her face closely, it's clearly a mask. It's a mask like these masks on axis on the other side here. And for many art historians, she represents deception, not truth. So we see Father Time trying to pull away the curtain to expose deception. And so what deception is he exposing? Well, what he's exposing is this relationship. These are the two goddesses, or goddess and god of love, Venus and Cupid, or Eros as he is known. And they're kissing. They shouldn't be, by the way. This is mother and daughter. Mother and son here. And Venus, by the way, you can tell it's Venus. She's got that golden apple in her hand. She's being caressed and fondled and so forth by this representative of love, but also her son. She doesn't want that to occur, and that's why she's ripped the arrow out of his hand. The arrow is the thing that inflames lust, and so she's not going to allow him to inflame her lust here. However, off to the right-hand side, you see a symbol of folly. He's a child, so he doesn't have a lot of good decision-making yet. He holds in his hands big blossoms of roses. That means the folly of love, or the folly of sexual passion. And behind him is a figure known as a chimera. A chimera is any type of figure that's part human and part animals. And this figure has a human head and human hands, but has some kind of snake's body, as well as lion's feet here. And anytime you see a chimera in the West, you're supposed to think something monstrous or questionable is being represented. If you were to be in the East or in Egypt and you see those chimeric figures, they're symbols of power. But in the West, they're always kind of monstrous hybrid creatures. And that figure probably represents pleasure. She has in her hand a honeycomb, which is a standard symbol of pleasure because it's so sweet and lovely. And by the way, that pleasure is something to be questioned because she's a chimeric figure. Then on the other hand side, you have this figure kind of tearing its hair out, and its face is all marked with these little, these kinds of well, in late syphilis, which is what this figure represents, the body starts kind of deteriorating. It's got all the scarification of someone who's in the advanced stages of syphilis. So that's a warning to everyone. And by the way, as the text points out, syphilis was raging in parts of Europe at this time, even though they didn't quite know exactly what was causing it. And so if you start putting it all together, the symbolism says something like, time will expose the deception and the folly of the pleasures of sex for pleasure, right? So, Father Time is ripping away the curtain to expose the deception of this scene. Deception is trying to hold the curtain up to make sure no one knows it. And that's probably what the kind of standard symbolism of the whole thing is. Of the Mannerist period, I wanted to show you one work by an artist whose name is Domenico Theotokopoulos, but he's better known as El Greco, the Greek. He was born in Greece. He came from Crete, and he worked in Greece for a while, and then for a brief period in Venice. And then he settled for the rest of his career in Spain, which was a very, very Catholic country during the time. And painted in his own kind of unique style. This is typical El Greco style. He was trained as an early Byzantine icon painter, and there's nothing quite like him. He's got his own personal style here. This is a work that's called The Burial of Count Orgaz from the end of the 1500s, about 1586. It was a work that was commissioned by the family of Count Orgaz, who was a major benefactor to Christianity, who had died a long time before this work was actually created. And what we see in the bottom register, and I'm going to get us up close here, in this part of the scene, what you see is very, very accurately represented all of the major members of the family and of the clergy of the time, including in the center here as the focal point. You see Count Orgaz coming to his funeral to watch him be laid to rest. And the people who are laying him to rest are very famous Catholic figures. This is St. Augustine to the right. And over here, St. Stephen, who was the patron saint of the family. Now, again, these people did not live at the same time as Count Orgaz, so it's a kind of imaginative reenactment of the scene in which the most important benefactors of the church come to lay to rest Count Orgaz. In the foreground, this is probably El Greco's son, just put in here as a kind of cameo, and then figures associated with the church on both sides. So to this stage, kind of standard representation, almost like a group portrait. Where it gets typically El Greco, if I slide this down to show you the upper register, is up here. This is what makes it very manneristic and very much identifiable as El Greco. Notice the way that this is painted. All of the forms seem insubstantial, like you can see through them, like they're made out of clouds rather than real flesh. Everything's been elongated. There's tons of movement up here, right? It's not the standard horizontal, vertical, or pyramidal form, or even if it's got a pyramid here, look at how all of this swirling movement happens on both sides of the work, right? That's typically El Greco. And to me, one of the most interesting things about this is, by the time that El Greco had painted this, those anatomy lessons that had started 100 years or so before, which all the artists were partaking in, those had become kind of public events. And in Spain in particular, there was a very, very famous surgeon who you'll hear about quite a bit when we get a little bit further on in these lectures, and we're looking at the Baroque period and Rembrandt's work. And the surgeon's name was Andreas Vesalius. And Andreas Vesalius had dissected human bodies and created this huge illustrated book on everything that he had found. And this included kind of all the interior parts of the body. And the reason I point this out is that when Count Orgaz dies here, his soul, which we see here in this little ghostly figure here, is being ushered back into heaven by this angel. And look at the form that he's going up through. This is clearly a birth canal, right? It's a vagina. He's being reborn into heaven kind of in reverse way. In life, and that's one of the ways that knowing more about the human body lent itself to artists' representations of subjects. The rebirth of the soul into heaven now takes place through the anatomy of a kind of cloud-like birth canal. So I'm going to pause here for a minute. Won't take long, and we'll return to the Northern Renaissance in Germany in just a sec. Okay, we've moved over to Germany, back to the Northern Renaissance. So let's reactivate some of the things that we said when we were talking about the Northern Renaissance in Flanders. The style's very similar in some ways, and then other things are inflected by the rise of Protestantism in this part of the world at this time. Number one, in Northern Renaissance works of art, remember, we have the same kind of rise of the middle class and so forth, but these areas are not as interested in classical aesthetics, and so you don't see interest in the idealization of the human body as often. You don't see the same priority placed on rationality and clarity and order and so forth. Instead, what you get a lot of is a greater degree of naturalism, right? Things that look believable. You've got a great degree of symbolism. You oftentimes have a lot more details and crowded compositions as well. And then also, remember we said that many times in the North, scenes that took place in religious times are reset in a contemporary setting in some way, and there are components of that in a lot of this work as well. So we start in what is today Germany. At the time, the Germanic nations were, of course, different little areas, Burgundia and Prussia and so forth, ruled by various lords, kind of remnants of what's known as the Holy Roman Empire. But we'll just call it Germany for our purposes today. And we're looking at a work here that's on the screen, a giant altarpiece. The figure of Christ there is life-size, and this altarpiece is known as the Eisenheim altarpiece, and it was painted by a German by the name of Matthias Grunwald. So, first and foremost, right off the bat, we all know what the subject matter is, right? It's a crucifixion scene. But it's a crucifixion scene unlike any you've seen before that emphasizes the human pain of the crucifixion, that human element of the sacrifice of Christ to allow us all to get into heaven. This is quite different if you think of comparing this to the Perugino work. It's quite different than what you see in classical works in that it's not idealized, it's very, very natural, and it's meant to play upon our emotions. It's meant to make us empathize with the pain and the torment that Christ went through in order to allow us to get into heaven. Now, this work was started about the same time that Michelangelo is working on the Sistine Chapel ceiling and that Raphael Sanzio is working on the School of Athens and so forth, just to set the context for you. So it's before Protestantism actually is announced in 1517. It's when Martin Luther nails his 98 Theses to the wall of Wittenberg Cathedral and critiques in particular, Catholic practice of indulgences. But the ideas are very similar to what the Protestants would, claim to be the proper way to understand God's will for you and to understand what you're supposed to be doing in the world. And what I mean by that is when the Protestants critique the Catholic Church, what they end up saying is that your best way to understand God is through the Word of God, through the Bible itself. Not through the intermediaries of the clergy necessarily, although the clergy can help you understand the Bible, and certainly not through art that idealizes the subject. Instead of this, in addition to the Bible, what Protestants say in general is that the connection between you and God is much closer. You don't have to go through these intermediaries. You don't have to go through your priest who goes then to the cardinal, to the bishop, to the pope, and so forth. You can understand God kind of directly, not only through the word of the Bible, but through what Protestants started calling the imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ. Now, in today, it's a very complex idea, which we're only barely skimming the surface of here. But if you think of that bumper sticker, I'm sure you've seen before, which says, like, what would Jesus do? It's kind of similar to that, right? Put yourself in Jesus's place. Understand what Christ went through. That's how you can understand the Bible. And the reason that's important here is that focusing in on the human agony of Christ, you can feel his pain. You can feel how much he sacrificed. And thus, the teachings of Christ come along with them, this kind of Christ sacrificed this much for us. He was willing to go through this. We should follow his teachings, knowing how much he loved us to sacrifice himself in this way. There's another element to this, though, too, before I even get to going through all the characters and the symbolism, which is that this particular altarpiece was created for a church that it ministered to people with skin diseases. Leprosy, which some of you know about, the body, when it's injured and someone has leprosy, can't really heal itself in the way that a healthy body could, and so a small cut can get infected and turn gangrenous very quickly, resulting in the only way to save people at this time period, if you could even save them, most of them couldn't be saved, is by amputating any kind of injured body parts. But most of the time, people with leprosy, died a fairly horrible death, which is why many times they were shuffled off into little quarantine areas, such as this church. The other major skin disease or disease that people who were being administered by this church ailed from was something known as St. Anthony's fire. St. Anthony's fire was a type of flesh-eating bacteria that was caused by eating infected grains. They were infected with an ergotism, most notably rye. And what this did was, of course, create flesh-eating diseases that were so painful, and eventually this disease reached the brain, that people who had this disease had massive hallucinations along with all the pain. And the term St. Anthony's fire was coined for this because St. Anthony was a Christian saint who was tormented by devils while he was out in the desert and was stricken with all these horrible hallucinations as well. So why do I bring that up now? Because we know that these people who are suffering from these terminal diseases and very painful diseases would have been brought in front of this altarpiece and shown it. And if that seems like a bitter pill to swallow, right? Like, look at this painful, horrible body tormented, and you'll see this up close in a minute with all of these little pustules and scars and wounds and so forth. That seems tough to take. Like, why would you show people who are dying of these horrible correspondent diseases this picture? There's actually a rationale behind it, and it's one that contemporary studies have proven is probably moderately effective. And that's that these people who are dying these horrible diseases, and everyone believed they were going to die, would have been brought in front of this and said, look at how much Christ sacrificed for you. Look at the pain that he went through for you to get into heaven. And they would have been told as well that unlike healthy people, maybe you, through the imitatio Christi, can empathize with the sacrifice Christ made more than others because you're going through these horrible torments too. And Of course, the payoff is if you continue to believe in Christ and you follow his teachings and you repent your sins and so forth, you will be reborn into heaven without any of this pain and torment of the human body. Now, he said that contemporary studies have proven this might be effective because while millions of dollars have been thrown at the question as to whether faith can heal, with no evidence showing that faith really heals people, a lot of evidence have shown that if you meditate or contemplate something that brings you I wouldn't say pleasure, but some level of relief or some, in this case, promise of a future stage in which you won't be tormented, that actually alleviates people's pain. Meditation, contemplation of your religion, and so forth can alleviate pain even more than modern painkillers can. And so it's possible that this idea that the people who are suffering from this disease could understand Christ better and thus could be kind of focusing their mind on the next life, might have brought them some alleviation of their pain, is believable here. So then this altarpiece sits upon what is known as a predella, this area down below in which you see a entombment scene. And then it's a triptych up above, a three-part altarpiece. In the center is the crucifixion. On the right-hand side of Christ, so our left-hand side, you see Mary Magdalene down below. We know it's Mary Magdalene because the long hair again, and because she's closer to his feet, and she has this jar of oils that she uses to anoint Christ's feet to keep him, to kind of alleviate his pain. We see once again John the Evangelist and Mary the Virgin, although this time around, Mary the Virgin is swooning. She's, fainting basically here. She's all in white, which is meant to make you feel her pain. And of course, the emotions that they show, being on diagonal, swooning, John the Evangelist's face shows great anguish, as does Mary Magdalene's face down here below, makes this a much more human, emotional, theatrical production than you would have seen, for instance, in Perugino's work. Off to Christ's left-hand side, to our right, is John the Evangelist with an open book, and below him a symbol of Christ's sacrifice, a lamb holding a crucifix and bleeding into a chalice. That chalice, of course, is a representation of the Holy Eucharist, the Holy Grail, right? The Eucharistic ceremony. Christ is the sacrificial lamb for all of us. But this is clearly the symbolic realm of the picture. None of this you would find in everyday life, obviously, including John the Baptist, who had already been martyred. He'd already been killed at this point when Christ is crucified. And what John the Baptist is actually saying, and it's written here, is as he increases, I decrease. And all that means is that as Christianity increases, Judaism, or the Old Testament, decreases in importance. Remember, John the Baptist was the last born before Christ. Then off to, in the side panels over here, is Saint Sebastian. Saint Sebastian was the patron saint of people with leprosy. And off to the right-hand side is Saint Anthony, the patron saint of people with Saint Anthony's fire. Now, another element of this is when you open this altarpiece up, which you do, and you can probably barely make out this line just off center here, it would amputate his arm. And if you open up the predella, which slides open, it amputates both his legs off, those corresponding with the types of surgical practices meant to extend the lives of the hospice patients here. Let's get up close on the central panel. Some things to point out in addition to the subject matter are, number one, obviously this body, which I'll show you more close-ups of, is in great kind of torment, right? The shoulder shouldn't do this. There are little thorns stuck in everywhere, little open wounds all over the place. His loincloth is ragged and jagged. Remember, jagged lines increase the intensity of our emotional response, as do the little staccato lines of this rib cage. They not only are associated with an emaciated body or stretched out body, but those little short lines actually agitate us. Instead of putting a nice calming background, we get this deep, dark scene with a little bit of green in it that's, makes us feel kind of sickly. And it also doesn't give us any relief. We don't have anywhere to look besides Christ's body. We just have to keep returning to it. Remember I said that in the Northern Renaissance, they try to make everything more empathetic, Christ more human or naturalistic. That's the case here, not only in the representation of his pain, but look at the transept or the arm of the cross as it bows down on each side. That shows all the weight that's pulling it down. Look at how the composition, unlike the Perugino work where he's way up above them, Christ is right down here amidst them. He's one of them. And of course, Christ, to make him more important than everyone else, is represented larger or in hierarchical scale. Then look at some of the details of Mary Magdalene and the Virgin Mary swooning and so forth. These are models for the way we're supposed to respond to this, a very human, emotional response to this painful death. Some of the details so you can see this, right? Everything about it is gruesome and horrifying and painful. It's meant to emphasize Christ's human sacrifice, all the pain and agony he went through for us, and thus corresponds to these people with the skin diseases who would have seen this. The screen is open. I'm not going to go through all of this, although it's really, really interesting. It would take us forever. So you open the scene up, and this is what it looks like on the interior of the altarpiece. On the far left is an Annunciation scene. In the center is a choir of angels singing the praises of Christ. Then over here is the Virgin Mary with the Christ child and the kind of nativity scene. I'm going to get us up close here for a minute so you can see some of these details. They're kind of cool. And you can look up any of these details by doing a Google search. So these are choirs of angels singing his praises. In this choir, by the way, there is a representation, right, if you follow my cursor over here on the far left, of a really beautiful, multi-feathered angel who is likely Satan. This is likely the devil over here. Remember when we saw in Robert Campan's work the little mouse traps and the idea that Christ was born so as to create curiosity in the devil so he could be trapped? Well, there he is in all of his curiosity, saying, what is this all about? Remember, you would represent Satan as incredibly beautiful because that's what led to his downfall. He thought he was just as beautiful or as important as God. He had a great deal of pride, and that's why he's cast out with the other angels. And then over here, very typical for the North, the birth is actually shown as more of a birth. These are kind of more human actors. You see an actual birthing bed here. That little strap there was used to hold the woman down and to help push the baby out. You even see a bath over here to clean the baby off. And right down here, believe it or not, is a chamber pot. So very kind of human birth, emphasizing that human birth, rather than some of the other scenes we see where he's already a kind of grown-up person. And then finally, off to the far right of the interior of this altarpiece, you see kind of the major component of it. This is Christ's resurrection. At this stage, he is a glowing nimbus. He's made up of this kind of white light, and all of those painful components of his death have gone away. This is to say to those people who are dying of skin diseases, and frankly everyone else, after the torments of our everyday lives, if we remain faithful to the word of Christ, we will all rise in perfection to heaven just as he did. Famous painter of the Northern Renaissance in Germany is Albrecht Dürer. Albrecht Dürer came from Nuremberg. He was, believe it or not, he came from a family of 18 other children who worked in the arts, including goldsmiths. He was an extraordinarily gifted artist and very, very ambitious. And I just wanted to show you a few of his works here. This is a very early portrait, a self-portrait by Albrecht Dürer. It's his marriage self-portrait. When he was married, it was through an arranged marriage, and to show his future bride and their family what he looked like on the one hand, and also the amount of skill he had as an artist. On the other hand, he painted this portrait to send to them. He holds in his hand a sprig of eryngium, which is it's an herb that was known as an aphrodisiac, so it's associated with sex in marriage. And I bring that up because in the North, the types of rules against sexuality or sex for pleasure, especially under Protestantism, are not the same as Catholics. Protestants don't believe that in the bonds of marriage that having sex just for pleasure is a bad thing. Catholics still believe, at least I should say Catholics, that's the wrong term. The Catholic Church believes that sex for pleasure in marriage is something that you shouldn't be doing. But up north, they're a lot more free with these types of things. And then on the back of this, importantly, he wrote a little quote that says, "My affairs will go as it is written in the stars." He is very, very confident in his artistic abilities, and he knew he was going to make a mark on history. His most famous self-portrait is this one, 1500. This self-portrait is, and I gave you a little reading by Albrecht Dürer. This is a self-portrait that shows you the Imitatio Christi kind of directly. It is Albrecht Dürer, but he looks like Christ, doesn't he? If you didn't know this was an artist, you'd think this has got to be a representation of Christ. He stares right back at us directly, which is an iconic position reserved, for the most part, for the depiction of gods or Christ. And here he is doing it himself. His hands, which are on his coat like this, if you just turn those around, they look like the blessing or benediction sign of Christ that he's always having. So he's saying that he's very close. He's not the same, but he is very close, and he seeks to emulate Christ in all things. And you will read when Albrecht Dürer is talking about in that series of excerpts of artist writings, when he's talking about how you achieve the ideal, on the one hand he says, you take a part of this person and a part of that person, you put it all together, but really you have to work from the idea. He says, and I quote, "The lie is in our perception," meaning we're all locked in our human senses and we'll never be able to truly understand God's perfection in the world. And then he goes on to say, very humanistically, but we should strive for perfection nonetheless. And that's what he's doing in his own art, striving for perfection. You can always tell Albrecht Dürer's work, he signs them very prominently. He wants everyone to know who does it with a giant A over a D, and then usually above that, the date. Albrecht Dürer made a boatload of money off of prints. He did a ton of oil paintings. I'm only showing you a few of these, but he did a ton of oil paintings. But oil paintings aren't particularly lucrative because they take a long time to create. A really complex oil painting can take years to finish. And of course, you can't sell a lot of those. So he decided to create prints. And prints are, once you've come up with a block from which a print is created, you can print off multiple copies of these things and sell them for cheaper prices to a much wider audience, right? Only certain people can afford a big oil painting, but many more people can afford the relatively more inexpensive prints. He also realized that around 1500, remember, everyone's freaking the heck out because it's a millennial date and they're wondering whether the second coming of Christ, that last judgment, is going to occur. He was smart about this, and he decided in this series, and this is one of them, called the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, that if he created scenes that were based upon the book of Revelation, the book that is about the second coming of Christ and the last judgment, that because everyone was worked up about this, he could sell a ton of these. And these were actually printed with, some of them had images on one side and actually the text from the book of Revelation on the other side translated into German, which was a new phenomena as well. Martin Luther's really going to push this idea of translating the entire Bible into local dialects so everyone can read and have access to the Bible. Before this, it was always in Latin, right? And very few people read Latin. So in this case, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse are basically kind of the soldiers of God who are sent to the earth among other things, to destroy all life so that every soul can be judged. And if you've ever seen a horror movie, you will have heard quotes from the book of Revelation. This one, in short, and I put this on your lecture guide for today, goes, "Come, and I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider named Death, and Hades was following close behind them. They were given a power over the fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth." So you see in the foreground Death on a pale horse, and then the other horsemen of the apocalypse here, who are figures like famine and plague and pestilence and so forth, killing off everything on earth. This type of print is what's called a woodblock print. And I don't know how many of you have maybe taken an art class where you did a lino print, linoleum cut print. But the way that this works is you take a piece of wood, and all the areas that you see that are white, those have been carved away. And the areas that look black are little pieces, ridges of wood that stick up, that when you ink it, those little ridges can be transferred to the paper here. So it's a really meticulous, difficult process to come up with the plate itself. But once you have the plate, you can reproduce it over and over and over again. A woodblock print can give you anywhere from 500 to 1,000 really good quality prints before it starts breaking down. Also, though, did works which are engravings. Engravings are a form of printing where you scratch into the surface of a soft metal plate, either copper or zinc, with little lines and crosshatch lines to create the modeling of the form. So everywhere you see here that's dark, that's a little scratch that was placed, or multiple little scratches placed in a piece of metal, and then when you ink that up, the ink actually sits in the little crevices, and the paper is pushed into those and pulls that print out. It's a really difficult process. We think that Albrecht Dürer probably came up with the design and worked with a number of print technicians to come up with these prints. This is the most famous of these prints, and it's one that I'll go over in great detail, and then I'll show you some of the other prints that he created very quickly. This one's called Adam and Eve. Again, I'm sure you all figured that out right off. This is Adam and Eve, and they are eating of the fruit from the Garden of Eden. But here's the backstory for this. Albrecht Dürer was very ambitious, and he was competing with the Italian Renaissance artists, at least in his own mind. The Italian Renaissance artists really didn't hold the Northern artists in very much esteem. Even people like Michelangelo said, listen, they're great at mimicking what the world looks like. They're great at that kind of descriptive ability, but they don't get art. They don't get rationality, clarity, order. They don't understand Neoplatonism and trying to create the ideal. They can only represent what they see. And remember what Plato said about mimicry, right? It's a copy of something that is already an imperfect copy of the realm of forms or the realm of heaven. And so these Italians didn't think much of the Northern artists. Well, Albrecht Dürer had heard all of that, and before his second trip to Italy, he went to Italy a couple of times. He only went to the northern parts of Italy. He decided to create this print and had it produced and printed off, and even sent multiple copies of this into Italy before he came, in order to kind of, announce his presence in a way. And the reason I bring that up is that he went out of his way in the figure of Adam to compose a human form that is a perfect canon of proportions. It's based upon Roman copies of Greek originals. You can measure every part out, and it's perfect example of the ideal male form. And that's his way of saying to the Italians, hey, listen, I know about ideals. I can do ideals. However, after creating that perfect male form, everything else in this picture is typically Northern Renaissance, right? It's a crazy crowded composition. It's got tons and tons of naturalistic detail, and it's filled with a ton of symbolism. The first symbol I want to point out is up here, right next to his head, is a parrot. And of course, Adam is holding onto the stick that has the parrot on it. Why the parrot? Because what do parrots do? They mimic what they hear. And it's his way of poking fun at the Italians for saying all you Northerners can do is mimic what you see. And then down below that, in what is called the cartellino, and a cartellino is just this kind of fake little plaque that's hanging from the tree, he writes his name, Albrecht Dürer, and then says, made in Nuremberg, 1504, right? Albrecht Dürer made this perfect representation of the ideal male body, which you all think we can only mimic what we see. And I came from Nuremberg, which is, of course, in Germany. Then going on with this, notice how Adam then reaches over to Eve. Eve is made out of a canon of proportions as well, but as I've said before, canons of proportions for female bodies, there are very few of them, so it's kind of a mixing together of female form with male canons of proportions. Eve is taking the fruit directly out of the mouth of the serpent, so she's more culpable. And Adam's reaching for that fruit, we think, although he's reaching kind of somewhere else to give the sexual innuendo to the whole thing, right? And then you see all these little animals around. These are all symbols. The four major symbols are the elk, the ox, the rabbit, and the cat. And I'm not going to go into great detail about this, but those four symbols represent what were known as the four humors of the body. And the four humors are kind of temperaments that the body has that originally when Adam and Eve were created were all in balance with one another. And then after the fall, they get out of balance with one another. And there's no way to kind of make sense of this. It's all medieval medical theory. But these four humors of the body were correspondent, supposedly, with different bodily fluids. So, for instance, the ox in the background is called the phlegmatic humor, so for phlegm. And just like when you get a cold and you're all kind of, phlegmy and so forth, oxes, and if you have a excess of phlegm in your body, causes great lethargy and you don't do anything, which is why he's sitting back there. Over here, the elk is associated with melancholy, which is kind of depression, but it's also a depression that leads to creativity. And it's caused by supposedly an excess of black bile in the liver or something like that. The rabbit down here is the sanguine humor, the blood humor. If you have an excess of blood or this part of the bodily fluid, you are overly optimistic and also overly desirous, horny, basically. And then prominent in the foreground is the cat, who is associated with cholera and with all the things that you would think of as cats, being kind of self-absorbed and grumpy and so forth. And it's supposedly caused by an excess of yellow bile in the liver. Then you see the mouse over here. Mice and rodents in general are generally symbolic of the devil or evil. And you can see that in his contrapposto pose, as Adam reaches to grab that apple, he is letting go of the tail that had otherwise been held under his foot so that the devil or evil is unleashed in the world. I just wanted to show you these because they're so magnificent. You have to remember, these aren't pencil drawings, right? It's not that easy. These are all created. Every single dark area that you see is created by little tiny scratches in the surface of a metal plate. This is the night, death, and the devil. It's another engraving. And it's about the active Christian life. In this case, a knight striding through the world on his horse, out to do good for Christianity, maybe go on to a crusade or, save a maiden or whatever knights do, who is being tormented by a devil in the back, this weird kind of half goat, half whatever the hell he is figure, and a symbol of death over here, a skeletal form who holds up an hourglass and says, hey, you're going to die one day or something like that. But none of this distracts the steadfast knight. Or a symbol of the contemplative Christian life, St. Jerome in his study, translating the Bible into the Vulgate. Remember, the Vulgate is the Latin version of the Bible. and St. Jerome did this. You'll always know it's St. Jerome because he's usually accompanied by his animal familiar or pet, a lion here, and he's usually, of course, hard at work transcribing. And he sometimes has a skull associated with him, which is that memento mori. And then finally, another from the series of the Master Prints, my favorite. This is Melancholia #1. Melancholia was, as we saw, something that is close to depression or inactivity. It's also associated with artistry, and what you see there here is the artist as an angel trying to set to work doing something, but kind of getting stuck, like having writer's block or something like that, associated with artistry. Let's move up to the Netherlands now, the area that's contemporary Netherlands today, but it also included areas that are also part of the upper reaches of Belgium and kind of a bigger territory at its time. And the stylistics remain the same, although this guy's work it's his own thing. There's nothing quite like it in the history of art at this time period, and people have been scratching their heads about this since they've been looking at it. You've probably seen this work before, but you may have never seen it closed. It's an altarpiece by Hieronymus Bosch, and it's an altarpiece probably ironically. It was never set before an altar. That's called the Garden of Earthly Delights. So when it's closed, this is what you see, a kind of globe of the earth. Now they figured out that the world is spherical, but they don't really know what to make of that yet. So you got kind of a spherical situation, but then a flat earth on it. And this is the world created before humans and animals have been created by God in there, and everything looks relatively peaceful. When you open this thing up, and I've given you a link to a really cool interactive site where you can go through and kind of learn more about this. So I'm just going to go over some areas of this. This is what it looks like, and it's a fairly big work that, as your text points out, seems to be about a fairly pessimistic medieval view of the world that goes, humans, even knowing better, are always bound to sin, right? They're going to screw up even though they know they shouldn't. And one of the big sins that keeps getting pointed to in this are earthly pleasures or pleasures of the flesh. So on the left-hand side, and I'll show you close-ups of this in a minute, you've got a scene in the Garden of Eden, usually referred to as the marriage of Adam and Eve. It's not clear that it's a marriage or if it's just the presentation of Eve to Adam, but what is clear is that in this earthly paradise filled with all kinds of cool animals, which, by the way, everyone had been out there trading a lot and going through Africa and the Far East and so forth, and artists had gone along on these and done little sketches of the animals. So you have giraffes in here and elephants and even in the foreground a platypus. And apparently in the Garden of Eden, they even had unicorns. So you have one of those there. But the big message of this is right at the moment in which Adam and Eve are introduced, evil is unlocked on the world because crawling out of this little pond in front of them are strange hybrid creatures and birds pecking at little toads and a cat carrying off a mouse over here. So we already start to see kind of strife enter the story. The center scene is all about earthly pleasures, primarily sexual pleasures, and then over on the right-hand side you have a scene of hell and the torments of hell that await you if you do these earthly pleasures. Now, your text doesn't point this out, but the belief of many people is that the weird, really cool representations in this painting probably were created from Netherlandish proverbs or sayings or witticisms. And that's why they're so weird and hard to interpret. So, for instance, many of you may have heard the phrase, 3 sheets to the wind. Now, we don't use that a lot today, but 3 sheets to the wind means being drunk, right? Well, where did that come from? Well, it comes from a nautical term where if you put your 3 sheets or sails up into the wind, the boat will tip over, just like drunk people tip over. So imagine a Netherlandish proverb, and by the way, in another work, Hieronymus Bosch actually used that saying, where various Netherlandish sayings are now illustrated to get to the sin that they're supposed to represent. Now, if we don't know what the Netherlandish proverbs were, the sayings were, in the first place, it's going to be impossible to interpret some of these symbols directly. But we'll go in here and look at some of them. And here is we're not going to spend much time on this. This is this beautiful scene in the Garden of Eden and the introduction of Eve to Adam. In the center is something that is a fountain shape that is probably meant to be the fountain of life. These weird shapes that show up throughout Hieronymus Bosch's work probably come from the practice of apothecaries and alchemy. Apothecaries were kind of early chemists, and his wife's family were apothecaries, so we would have seen these strange little glass beakers around everywhere. And alchemy was, on the one hand, it was this kind of attempt by, starting in the Middle Ages, by people to transmute base materials into gold, like turn lead into gold through chemical processes. Of course, it never worked. But it's also understood to be a spiritual process by which, through these weird mystical alchemical cults, you could transmute your base human soul into the higher form of the transcendent soul in heaven. And he may have been referring to these things as false ways that people in cults tried to make their way into heaven. As a matter of fact, let's go up here first in the foreground here. You can see some of this, right? Over here, a cat carrying away a mouse, birds pecking at various frogs and toads in the foreground, or eating one over here. Strife is already occurring, or a multi-headed bird here, a chimeric form. To the central scene here, one of the interpretations, and there are a billion of these out there, that is completely uncompelling, was that this work was actually created for a group of people known as the Adamites, or the Brethren of the Free Spirit, which was a cult that practiced basically nudity and free love as if they existed in the Garden of Eden before the fall of mankind, as a pathway to their spiritual salvation. And this cult really did exist, but there's no reason to believe that Bosch actually created this work for them. As a matter of fact, there's no reference to this cult for 100 years before he painted this work. But if he were referring to this would be a way of him pointing to humans trying to find the easy way into heaven instead of following the word of God. This central scene is set up as kind of three not quite discrete registers. Up on the top are these weird fountains and alchemical figures, all with nude figures kind of showing off for each other. That continues into this middle register here, where there are these beautiful women in a pond who are, touching each other and playing with each other and flirting with all these men. And they're not only men out here, but primarily men who are showing off for them. I mean, we've seen this a million times, right? Boys showing off for girls that they find attractive. And there's some symbolism here. Having sex, one of the analogies for it was, or the sayings for it was like swimming in the bath of Venus. So when you see a bath or a water or people swimming, it's an association with that idea of sex. And in the foreground, then, tons of these weird interactions of figures and symbols that are probably based upon Netherlandish proverbs that refer to various sins of the flesh. So we'll get up there close for a minute. You can look up more of these as we go along. What we do know is that birds with long beaks are associated with sex. It's the phallic nature of the beak here. That here, where you see a white man and a woman of color, and by the way, pictures of people from different ethnicities were coming into Europe all the time, that this isn't a nod towards interracial relationships. At this time, it was believed that interracial relationships were against God's will. And so this is, something that is sinful. In this middle scene, these are all close-ups of various scenes. So you see a close-up here of this over here. You see a man embracing an owl Now, owls are creatures of the night, and so this is meant to be kind of a symbol of the embrace of evil knowledges, knowledge of the night, right? Light is God, dark is the devil. Then you see things like this over and over again. Two people in a bubble, touching each other. Bubbles, as well as the fruit you see all over here, refer to Netherlandish proverbs about the transience or brevity or shortness of the pleasure that comes with sex, right? So you can get caught up with sex, and I'm not saying anyone's ever done this before, right? You probably don't know what I'm talking about, but you get caught up in the moment, you go for the pleasure of sex, and then afterwards the bubble pops, and so to speak, and you are, wondering why you did that. So bubbles and fruit as well. There was a Netherlandish proverb that says sex is as transient as the taste of a strawberry on one's tongue. You know, once you've eaten it, it only lingers for a moment and then it's gone away. And of course, you're supposed to be thinking about your spiritual salvation here. Fruit as well, though, just in general, is symbolic of fertility and sex. A few more of these, right? Sorry, no one knows what the hell this is, right? We've got a guy doing a headstand underwater with some kind of weird fruit on his genitals and a bird emerging from this, but everyone thinks this probably had to do with some weird Netherlandish proverb. Again, think of all the weird adages or sayings we have. When I was much younger, and I worked for this kind of road crew that went out and repaired, little potholes in the road with these two older guys. They used to make fun of me constantly, and they had a saying for everything. And so they would say, for instance, that kid doesn't know his asshole from his elbow, right? And if this were Bosch, he would literally, in order to show someone stupid, put a guy with his elbow in his asshole looking at it, trying to figure out which is which. Or they used to say, he's dumber than a box of rocks. And if Bosch was doing this, he might, instead of having a head on a finger, put a box full of rocks up there, what have you. But we don't know what many of these are. There are lots of little allusions to homosexuality, which was understood as a sin. So two guys getting together here. Or masturbation. This guy's eating his own strawberry. That's a sin, right? Over here, people in the sexual act or being fed by a bird, fruit. This is all about sex. In the middle realm, again, women in this swimming in the bath of Venus with guys going around on horses trying to show off for them. One of the most interesting scenes, and we're only going to focus on the foreground here, is his scene of hell. And just as Dante Alighieri had earlier on in the Inferno set out to show that people in hell would be punished by sins that were commensurate with what they had done in life. So Bosch does this as well in his scene. Up in the top register is a scene of kind of burning buildings, the Armageddon, that last judgment. In the center scene are a bunch of other sins, but we're going to focus down here on the ones that we can most identify here below. If we start off to the left here, what we see are sins that are associated with gambling. So we've got backgammon here, we've got playing of dice here, and playing of cards here. And gambling was a sin, not because of practical reasons, like people could lose their money. Gambling was a sin because it invoked the element of chance in the world. And God was all about order and predictability, and the devil was all about chance. So games of chance were considered suspicious or sinful because they partook of the realm of the devil. And so that's what you see over here, a hand cut off, stabbed through with a knife, another hand stabbed with a knife. And important to point out here, this woman has been taken as the game, the kind of kill of this rabbit who is the hunter. These types of symbols actually come out of medieval marginalia. These are in the margins of illuminated manuscripts where they show you all the things that you're not supposed to do. Or I think I said before here, earlier on in the quarter, you can see scenes of, for instance, rabbits being the hunters, whereas rabbits are supposed to be the hunted. So it's an inversion of the natural order of things in the same way that using chance is an inversion of God's order in the universe. Over here in the center scene, you see a scene up here. Remember, blown instruments are about sex. This is about homosexuality. This guy is playing his recorder in a way that you're not supposed to play it, as far as I know. It's kind of inserted in him. So that's seen as, the sin for these people of homosexuality. Over here, you have a scene that's probably about gluttony. So if you're a glutton, you ate too much or consumed too much, you will endlessly be eaten by this strange devil who has a bird head. And then you are crapped out into the cesspool here. This guy's crapping in here, and you get crapped there. This guy's vomiting in there. And then one presumes you go through the same cycle over and over again. Down below here, the sin of vanity. A woman who has been too vain, too caught up in her own material appearance, has to stare at her likeness in the ass end of a devil for all time. And then over here on the right, by contemporary standards, a lesser known sin, but we know what this is, so I pointed out. This is the sin of attrition, as it's known. This is the sin of professing a love of God, but only if you want a reward or you fear punishment. It's not a true love of God. And in this case, this guy has to kiss for all times a pig-headed nun. I love Bosch. You could spend all day on Bosch and still not know what he's all about. So spend some time kind of playing around with that interactive, illustrated work that I linked you to. We'll end up today looking at another Netherlandish painter, Peter Bruegel the Elder. Peter Bruegel started off his career kind of emulating Bosch, and then became known for painting genre scenes, which are scenes of everyday life, which is much more what you find in the North than you would ever find in the South. I started us off here with a pretty straightforward work called The Fall of Icarus, in order to show you how the Netherlandish painters knew what the Italians were up to, but wanted to do their own thing. And this is his kind of way of poking fun at the Italians while showing you what is more important to people in the Netherlands. Overall, what we get is a scene of a beautiful harbor with boats going in and out. Remember, in the north, trade made everyone incredibly rich. The Dutch, of course, had these great trade routes that everyone wanted. And this age of exploration and trade had really elevated the wealth of this area. So we see that. But then we also see in the foreground kind of the simple pastoral life of everyday folk. A farmer tilling his field, and a shepherd right down there below him, everyday people at their work. The title of the work, The Fall of Icarus, actually refers to this little thing over here. You see some kind of flailing legs in the water here, which no one is noticing. Icarus and Daedalus is a famous Greek myth. And like most Greek myths, it's got a moral message to it. Some of you will have heard this before. Daedalus was a great inventor, kind of the most brilliant inventor of his time, who was imprisoned for not working for a particular leader on an island with his young son, Icarus. Now, he wasn't going to stay there, even though he didn't have a boat or any way to build a boat to get off the island. What he did was he fashioned wings made out of the feathers of the birds on that island and wax made from bees' nests on that island. And then he told his young son, Icarus, they were going to fly off the island using these wings. Now, it's worth remembering that flying is kind of like transcendence. Flying, before we figured out how to fly, was the big longing of mankind to escape the bounds of the earth. And it's, for Greeks, very much tied up with the idea of hubris, striving. And hubris literally means kind of excessive pride in something, striving to go beyond your human limitations. So as they get ready to fly off the island, Daedalus, the father, says to his son, don't fly too high to the sun, which is a parable for don't have excessive pride. Don't have too much hubris. And they fly off, but then Icarus gets caught up in his desire to fly higher and higher, and he flies too close to the sun, and it melts his wings, and he crashes into the sea to drown. Now, all that's happening, but no one pays it any attention, and so the parable here is something like, we know what the Greeks thought was important. We understand that the Italians really like these things, but in Holland, we're much more practical people, and we don't have time for all these elaborate parables. As a matter of fact, you can't really see it very well in this picture, but right down here in front of the plow in this shrubbery is a tombstone, and that's probably a reference to the Netherlandish proverb that goes, "The plow stops for the death of no man." In other words, death occurs, but we can't stop doing our work because death is a natural part of life. A much different type of proverb than the really elaborate analogy in the story of Daedalus and Icarus. Very briefly, I wanted to show you this work. The Netherlands on and off had been ruled by the Habsburg regents, the kings from who controlled Spain at this time. The Habsburg family was an incredibly rich family. And, you know, they're in and out of the Netherlands, taking it over, and then the Netherlands or Holland fights back and push them out for about a century. I'll come back to that in a moment. What you're looking at here is a work that's called The Carrying of the Cross. And it's, you know, I mainly bring this in to show you, wow, this has got to be a northern work, right? There's no way an Italian artist, the Quattrocento or High Renaissance, would have painted this, because where's the focal point, right? Where are we supposed to look first? Where are we supposed to look second? Where's the use of linear perspective? Where's the organization of space? It all just seems chaotic and frantic. And that's because it's clearly a northern work. In the foreground are the main characters in the story of the carrying of the cross. Besides Jesus, you've got John the Evangelist, and you've got the Virgin Mary. Then you've got one of the other Marys, probably Mary Magdalene over here. Then you can barely see him. He's right in the center, but this is Christ carrying his cross and collapsing under his weight, while everyone else is just like people having fun getting to the execution. They're all arguing with each other or talking to each other or running to get a good seat at the execution itself. This is basically Bruegel's indictment of his own time period, that people seem more caught up in the spectacle of executions, which were happening all the time by the Habsburg regents, than they are in doing the right thing. In the foreground here, for instance, is what's known as a wheel of death. These were used by the Habsburgs to basically crucify people. You take a young sapling, a green sapling, and bend it over, and these things that are basically like wagon wheels that hadn't been completed, people would be tied to these and left to basically starve and dehydrate in the sun, and then have their bones picked away by ravens and crows and so forth, and no one was stopping this stuff. One scene, a genre scene from a series of 4 paintings on the cycles of the year. This one is called The Return of the Hunters. We mentioned before, and your text can kind of point you to the specifics of this, that books of hours, like the Tre Rish are illuminated manuscripts keyed into particular biblical passages or psalms associated with different times of the year. Well, painting cycles on that same idea got very popular in the North during this time period, where you paint a scene of winter to be associated with various religious activities, or summer or fall, and so forth. In this case, one of the great joys of this is showing what maybe a northern town would have looked like in winter and what people did. Hunters returning with their game and their hounds. People, preparing for the feast over here. And then this, whole host of people ice skating down here below, and what this all would have looked like. Remember, the northern painters are much more inclined to paint things naturalistically than you get in the South. So these give us little glimpses of what that world might have looked like. Bruegel is also famous for turning biblical parables into paintings. This is the parable of the blind. It comes directly out of the Bible. It says, if the blind shall lead the blind, they will fall into the ditch. And it's about spiritual blindness, right? If you follow a leader who doesn't know what the hell he's talking about, he's going to lead you astray. I'm not going to make any allusions to contemporary politics, but keep your eyes open here. And that's what you get here. Here are real blind people, and they're painted so naturalistically. He's obviously observed people with different types of blindness that apparently, if you're an optometrist or ophthalmologist, you can look at these people and note that someone's got blindness because they were born without orbs, other has blindness because of glaucoma, others had some kind of injury. It's all accurate representations of blindness, but the parable is really about spiritual blindness. And this is probably a critique of Catholicism. If you follow the false prophets or the blindness of the Catholic Church, they're going to lead you into the ditch, right? Lead you away from salvation. Or cripples here. These cripples who all have these little things that are actually symbols of their standing and these little feathers on them. This allows them to beg for alms. At this time period, cripples were actually thought to have been punished by God in some way, and Bruegel is kind of poking fun at them, unfortunately, here. And we'll just end with this work. This is a work called The Peasant Wedding. And The Peasant Wedding is one of Bruegel's most famous scenes. It's a genre scene, so an everyday subject, certainly something that's a little bit more lowbrow than what you would have seen in the Italian Renaissance. In other words, these are peasants getting married. And so the question becomes kind of like at the start, who would have wanted this picture painted? Because these peasants couldn't have afforded this picture. And the answer is probably a rich benefactor. This space where the peasant wedding is taking place, we know was, if you follow my cursor, owned by this man over here who's much more richly dressed. Perhaps he had a work like this commissioned so as to show how nice he was to the peasantry. Perhaps he had this work commissioned because maybe a couple of generations before this, he came from the peasant class, or his family did, and they had achieved great things. And he wanted to look back on, with a kind of degree of nostalgia on where he came from. When I first learned about this work, all anyone could talk about was how wonderful it was to see an accurate representation of the peasantry at this time. And to some degree, that's totally true. These are the types of clothes they wear. These are what a wedding would look like. For instance, there's lots of alcohol being poured. Weddings are much the same today. And this is what is known as wedding pudding. It's a very rich, it's pudding, which you eat with your hands, and it's got a whole bunch of sexual innuendo to it. But then the more we looked at it, the more we started to figure out that he's poking a little bit of fun at the peasantry as well. It's not like he's totally beating them up, but he does want to show that these peasants deserve to be in their position of life. And what I mean by that is they're all doing things that by the standards of upper classes would have been seen as vulgar, as, peasants acting like peasants. So they drink too much, they eat too much. They're drinking so much that you can go your way through this and see them. They'll have kind of ruddy complexions on their face. Many of them look like simpletons. I mean, he's gone out of his way to make them look like they've got kind of cross-eyed or look simple. The bride herself, who is sitting in front of this marriage blanket with her crown above her head, is about the most kind of homely of all the women in this. Her eyes are closed as if she's falling asleep, and her husband is nowhere to be found. He's out making merry, I suppose. And then there's prominent display of cod pieces, which are things that cover your genitalia, and bagpipes, which are not only used, but also in many Netherlandish proverbs, symbols of sexual activity. And again, It's not so dissimilar, I think, than weddings today, where people drink too much, they act a little stupid from time to time, and they get caught up in romance, so they hook up with other people from time to time. And this is his way of both showing what a wedding looks like, as well as poking a little bit of fun at the lower classes who have not elevated themselves to the status of those who would have commissioned these works of art. Well, I hope you had fun this week on the Mannerist period and the continuation of the Northern Renaissance. And we'll return next week to start looking at the Baroque period.